I was a student in the 60s, and that was a passionate time of searching. People could hitchhike then, and often in Europe, say, you go to a crossroads and seeing people hitchhiking, and one would be reading Nietzsche, one would be reading Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, one would be reading C.S. Lewis, and the conversations would just be raging between them and what the meaning of life was. And then that disappeared in the 70s with the so-called me decade and narcissism and so on. And I'm glad that there is actually more searching today. And I think mainly because of the huge challenge of globalization, the environmental problems, the challenges of justice and human trafficking. There is a lot more serious thinking on the campuses today than there have been for some time. And I'm very grateful. And I try and encourage people to think deeply about the meaning of life. Winston Churchill used to call the years 18 to 25 the Big Seven. In other words, the years when most people thought through the meaning of life, who they're going to marry, what job they're going to have, and so on. But the fact is, our universities have got away from thinking about the big questions. Socrates said very famously, the unexamined life is not worth living. And if he was right, many American campuses are encouraging a form of life not worth living. Anthony Kronman, the dean of Yale, has written a book on education arguing American universities are no longer teaching about the meaning of life. Things like the pursuit of credit or the gaining of credentials so that we can really have a fine career. In other words, the professional, occupational concerns have drowned out people thinking about the meaning of life. Also, we've had, for 30-odd years, the dominance of postmodernism. There was no such thing as truth, no such thing as grand narratives and meaning, and that too has squelched a lot of people from searching. But I'm glad that the big questions are coming back in once again. When Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living, he was surely pointing to what, say, social sciences would say when they talk about every human being needs a sense of security and a sense of meaning and belonging. We need to make sense of our world. We need to find security in life. And the deepest answers, the deepest philosophies of life, the deepest worldviews are actually grounded in faith and in religion. Science does not answer many of those deep questions, and it's only faith and worldviews which do. So I really challenge people to think them through. George Steiner, the great literary critic, a Jewish literary critic, he says, we're not so much Homo sapiens, we're Homo quaerens, the animal that asks and asks. We want to find answers to life, and we want to find some big answer in the light of which all our other questions and answers make sense. And of course, that's why people should start seeking and searching. The trouble is today that with our consumer society, many people are just channel surfing or hopping and shopping or passing down the smorgasbord of the buffet of opportunities. That is not a searcher. A searcher or a seeker is someone for whom life has become a question and they want an answer. Freud and people who follow Freud were actually wrong over that. Nobody looks for an answer because they have needs. What they really do, they become seekers, searchers, or questioners because of needs which their previous faith didn't answer. In other words, they disbelieve before they believe. And the key first stage in a search is when life becomes a time for questions. In other words, the universe either theoretically or practically raises a question which their previous faith doesn't answer, and they start looking for answers. They become seekers, and that's wonderful. They don't believe because of the questions. What they do is disbelieve what they used to believe. The Christian church in the West is at one of the lowest points since before the 16th century Reformation. Much of the Western church is shallow, crass, vulgar, distorted, and worldly. And so many people, as they start thinking for themselves, have questions that just burst through the faith that many churches have brought them up with. And particularly when they go to universities, they're taught to think critically. They think, the church I came from didn't encourage me to think. Thought that when I had doubts, it was being disloyal to God, and so on. So the churches have done a bad job in general, but also a bad job in particular in encouraging young people to think and to really grow along with the questions that they have in life. And many people, for that reason, fall away when they get to university. If you look at the things that are the triggers in people's lives that drive them to start searching for the meaning of life, you can see a whole number of different types. For instance, for some people, it's just the passages of life. As I said earlier, 18 to 25 is the big 7 years when most people are thinking. But then again, often people in their midlife years start thinking. They feel somewhat as a square peg in a round hole. Life hasn't worked out as they hoped. Or maybe it's later on when they realize that they're approaching the end of their life on earth, they start thinking again. So seasons of life are a very big reason. Another reason are the grand historical crises. Take, say, Marxism. In the 1920s, millions of people in the West, including many intellectuals, believed strongly in Marxism. But then the revelation of the terror famine in the Ukraine, the revelation of the Gulag, and then, of course, in 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now you only meet a few old-line Marxists among some of the 10-year radicals who came out of the 1960s. For most people, Marxism has collapsed for historical reasons that everyone's seen. Another way that people start to think, and this is the one that I've always been intrigued with most, are personal experiences in people's lives. C.S. Lewis, the great Ulster atheist, described his cracks in the armor of atheism came when he was, quote, surprised by joy. Wasn't happiness, that depends on circumstances. Wasn't pleasure, that comes from the five senses. Joy, as he said, he had unsatisfied desires that were more desirable than any satisfaction he knew. And it cracked his atheism, and he started to search. It was many years before he found an answer, but he was a searcher. Or another of my favorite writers is G.K. Chesterton. He went to art college in the 1890s, very like our postmodernism, cynical, bitter, dark, pessimistic. But Chesterton said he was, quote, stopped in his tracks by a dandelion. What did he mean? In other words, the world was dark in many ways, unjust, unfair, broken, oppressive. We all see that today, especially after Auschwitz. But at the same time, the birth of a baby, a Mozart sonata, a sunset over a Californian beach. He was stopped in his tracks by a dandelion. There was something so beautiful, and whatever the answer was, it had to include both the darkness of the world and the wonder of the world. And he became a seeker. So I've always been fascinated with the experiences that people have. My mentor, Peter Berger, calls this signals of transcendence. People living their lives, experiencing things which make them think beyond the worldview that they believed in previously.